We're going to start today with the map that you need to fill in. I thought I would help you fill in some of the cities, some of the waterways, and some of the people groups where they lived. So we're going to start with the Sea of Galilee, the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River. And I may go through these rather fast. If you need to stop the video at any point to fill in the information, feel free to do that. We're going to move on from the bodies of water to the cities that are listed there. So to the north there we have the city of Shechem, and then Shittim, Gilgal, Jericho, Ai, Gibeon, Beth Horon, Aijalon, and Azekah. Moving to the south, we have Kadesh Barnea. Remember that Kadesh Barnea was the area that the people of Israel were camped at when Moses sent the 12 spies into the Promised Land. Now we're going to fill in where the people groups were located. To the southeast of the Dead Sea, the Edomites were located. Just east of the Dead Sea were the Moabites, and northeast of the Dead Sea were the Ammonites. Remember that the Edomites were descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. The Moabites and the Ammonites were descended from Abraham's nephew Lot. West of the Dead Sea, we had the area inhabited by the Hittites, the Perizzites, and then the Philistines were there along just the coast. A lot of historians think that the Philistines originally came from the island of Crete and were colonizing that area. The Jebusites were north of the Hittites and the Perizzites. The Amorites a little further north than the Jebusites, and then the actual tribes of the Canaanites. The Girgashites were north of the Canaanites, as were the Hivites. And by the city of Byblos, along the coast there, we have the Phoenicians. Remember that the city of Byblos was the city that, when we were reading Egyptian literature, that city kept coming up over and over again as being a city that the Egyptians revered and honored the people from. Now the Hivites, the Girgashites, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, and the Hittites were the 7 Canaanite tribes that God instructed the Israelites just to destroy, get them out of the land. And when we discuss their pantheon, their gods and their goddesses, you'll get a little bit more insight into the kinds of things that they did to practice their religion and why God felt like that in order for the Israelites not to be contaminated by those same practices, those people just needed to be out of the land. When you read through the instructions on your map this week, one thing that it's going to ask you to do is to shade in the different bodies of water, so don't forget to do that. In addition, it's going to ask you to use a green crayon or a green colored pencil to trace the route that the Israelites came in and began to conquer the Promised Land. And so they moved across the Jordan River to the city of Jericho, through Ai and up to the city of Bethel, down to Gibeon, Aijalon, and Azekah. And then from Azekah they moved northward to Shechem. One other thing that the directions for the map is going to ask of you is to research where each of the tribes of Israel ended up settling in the Promised Land. And so I'm not going to go through that with you today. Instead, I would suggest that you just Google Israelites divide the Promised Land, and it will come up with a map that you can easily find that information. Here's an example of a map that I found. And if you'd rather not Google it online, you can go ahead and look in the map section of your Bible at home to find this information. This past week, you were asked to read through several of the Amarna letters. Recall that they were letters that were found at the city of El Amarna, most of them were addressed to Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV. And they were letters from the provincial governors in the land of Canaan, asking primarily for help from the Egyptian king as the governors tried to fend off an invasion from the Habaru. Now, we're not going to read through all of the letters, but I do want to point out to you how each of the provincial governors were very reverent when they wrote their letters to the king of Egypt. It doesn't matter how much of the rest of the letter complained, they each one started their letter by being very reverential. From one of the letters of Abdu Heba of Jerusalem, he starts with, "At the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times, and 7 times I prostrate myself. What have I done to the king, my lord?" I'd like to remind you that the word prostrate means to lay flat on the ground with your face downward, especially in reverence or submission. And on your worksheet, there was a picture showing Canaanite governors standing before Pharaoh Horemheb and prostrating themselves before him. And from the letters of Rib Adi of Byblos, we read, "At the feet of my lord, my son, I fall down 7 times and 7 times. And again, at the feet of my lord, my son, I fall down 7 times and 7 times. And from the letters of Labayu of the city of Shechem, it says, "To the king, my lord, and my God, and my son, thus speaks Labayu, your servant, the dust under your feet. At the feet of the king, my lord, and my God, and my son, 7 times and 7 times I prostrate myself." And from the letter of Yapahu of Gezer, we read, "The dust of your 2 feet, the stableman of your horse. At the 2 feet of the king, my lord, the sun in the sky, 7 times and 7 times I prostrate myself, both upon the belly and the back. And to all that the king, my lord, has told me, I have paid close attention. I am the king's servant and the dust of your 2 feet." In addition to the Amarna letters, this past week you read in your Biblioplan about Moses and the Israelites coming to Mount Sinai and being given the 10 Commandments. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about ancient covenants that we find in the Bible. In Exodus chapter 19 we read, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The word covenant there comes from the Hebrew word berit. It was also used to mean treaty, but in Exodus 9 it is used to mean covenant. That word appears 270 times in the Hebrew Bible. Ancient covenants around the time of Abraham were made using an animal sacrifice, and it was called a cutting covenant. The word brit implies the shedding of blood because of this. There are 3 major types of covenants that are found in the Bible. The first one that I want to talk about today is the grant covenant. The grant covenant was a covenant when a greater and a lesser person or nation came into covenant, and the greater one took on all the obligations. The lesser one only needed to receive the covenant. An example of this in the Bible is the covenant that God made with Noah. In that covenant, found in Genesis chapter 9, God promises to Noah and his descendants after the flood that he will never destroy the world again by flood. This covenant has several distinguishing features. First, it's an unconditional covenant. There's nothing that Noah or his sons can do to change God's mind about this. There's nothing that Noah can do that will stop that covenant. Second, the covenant was made to Noah and all of his descendants, as well as every living creature and the earth in general. And third, it was sealed with the sign of the rainbow. The covenant that God made with Abraham is also considered to be a grant covenant. It's an unconditional covenant. The actual covenant is found in Genesis chapter 12, and the ceremony for it is recorded in Genesis chapter 15. It indicates that it is an unconditional covenant. When a covenant was dependent upon both parties keeping commitments, then both parties would pass between the pieces of the animal sacrifice that was made. However, we read in Genesis 15 that only God moves between the two halves of the animals because Abraham was asleep at the time. God's solitary action indicates that the covenant is principally his promise to Abraham and his descendants, and he himself binds that covenant. Again, it is a grant covenant. There's nothing that Abraham can do that will change God's mind. It is unconditional favor. Remember that the covenant with Abraham was renewed with Isaac and then renewed again with Jacob. When a covenant was made, it only lasted until one of the covenant partners died, and then the covenant was over. In the case of Abraham, God renewed the covenant with Isaac, and he renewed the covenant again with Jacob. And the covenant that God made with David is also considered to be a grant covenant. We're referring to God's promise to David through the prophet Nathan that's found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is an unconditional covenant made between God and David, through which God promises David and Israel that the Messiah would come from the lineage of David and the tribe of Judah and would establish a kingdom that would endure forever. The Davidic covenant is unconditional because God doesn't place any conditions of obedience upon its fulfillment. The surety of the promises made rests solely on God's faithfulness and doesn't depend at all on David or Israel's obedience. The second kind of covenant that I want to talk about is called a kinship covenant. It was a covenant that was made between two equal parties when they would come together to make a covenant, such as a marriage ceremony. Each party took on a small list of obligations in order to enter the covenant. In the case of a marriage ceremony, for example, we still make promises. It's just a small list. I will love, honor, and obey till death do us part. Biblical scholars would put the Mosaic covenant that was made between Moses and God in the book of Exodus in the category of a kinship covenant. It is conditional, made between God and the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, found in Exodus chapters 19 through 24. And the pattern of the covenant is very similar to other ancient covenants of that time because it was between a sovereign king, in this case God, and his people or his subjects, in this case Israel. At the time of the covenant, God reminded the people of their obligation to be obedient to his law, and the people agreed to the covenant when they all said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." Now I'd like to add a caveat to that. Many Bible scholars believe that God was actually offering the Israelites a grant covenant in Exodus chapter 19. Remember that he promised that they would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He told them that they were to consecrate themselves for 3 days, and then on the third day they were to come to the foot of the mountain to meet with God, and then they were supposed to come up on the mountain when they heard the blast of the horns. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The next thing we read in the book of Exodus, God is telling the people not to come up on the mountain, because if they come up on the mountain, then he will punish them. And so often when I read that, I did not understand what was happening. Luckily, Deuteronomy chapter 5 fills the reader in a little bit more than Exodus does as to what exactly happened. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 we read, "When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leaders of your tribes and your elders came to me and said, 'The Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. Today we have seen that a person can live even if God speaks to them. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire, as we have, and survived? Go near and listen to all that the Lord our God says. Then tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you. We will listen and obey.'" In Exodus 19:24 says, "The Lord replied, 'Go down and bring Aaron back with you, but the priests and the people must not cross the boundary to come up to me, or I will punish them.'" And so between reading the Exodus narrative and being filled in a little bit more in the Deuteronomy narrative, we see that God was offering the people to come up on the mountain and meet with him and enter into a grant covenant with them. But the people were afraid they wouldn't go up on the mountain to meet with God, and instead they offered to enter a kinship covenant with God. Here we see a photograph of what an ancient kinship covenant would have been recorded on. According to the research that I did, an ancient covenant, a kinship covenant that is, would have been carved on a small stela similar to the one that you see here. This one is found in the British Museum, and the British Museum actually has dozens of these that they have on display, of these ancient kinship covenants, where the rules that each of the partners in the covenant are to obey are carved into the stone. Now, the Bible says that God carved the Ten Commandments into the stone, and in our popular imagination, we like to think of giant stones. You know, you've seen the Sunday school pictures of Moses coming down with the mountains with these giant stelas that he's holding, and 5 of the commandments are written on one of the stones, and 5 of the commandments are written on the other stone. According to historians, what actually would have happened is this, that the commandments or the conditions of the kinship covenant would have been carved completely on one stone, whether it was on one side of it or if it was very long on one side and then also on the back. And then a second copy would have been carved completely on the second stone. Now, in the case of 2 tribes making a covenant, one of the tribes would have taken one of the stones back to their home. They would have put the stela with the covenant carved on it into what was called an ark of the covenant. And they would have sworn that they would keep the covenant. And if they did not keep the covenant, they would have sworn that their God, not their covenant partner's God, but their God would punish them for not keeping the covenant. Meanwhile, the other tribe would have taken their covenant stone home with them, put it in their own ark of the covenant, and they would have sworn also, we will keep this covenant, and if we don't, our own God, not the other tribe's God, but our own God will punish us if we don't fulfill our obligations and keep this covenant. And so you can see the tragedy of the Israelites choosing to enter into a kinship covenant with God rather than the grant covenant that he wanted to enter into with them. God had already entered into a grant covenant with Noah and his family. He had already entered into a grant covenant with Abraham and his family, and he was offering all the people of Israel to enter into a grant covenant with them. He was going to make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But because they were afraid, they drew back and they counter-offered God. Instead of entering into a grant covenant with you, we're going to send Moses up there as our representative, and he's going to enter into a kinship covenant with you. And so that really put God into an awkward position. First of all, he was their covenant partner. And second of all, he was their God. And so if they did not fulfill the obligations of the covenant that they entered into with God, it was his job to punish them. When we look back at Noah got away with getting drunk and cursing one of his sons because he was embarrassed when one of his sons looked upon him in his nakedness and his drunkenness. God didn't punish Noah for that. He had entered into a grant covenant with him. And so it was just favor from God on Noah. Similarly, Abraham, when he lies about Sarah being his sister rather than his wife, not once but twice, God doesn't punish Abraham for doing that. Instead, he backs Abraham up and makes sure that Sarah isn't compromised at all, even though Abraham has put her into a bad position herself. God does this because he had entered into a grant covenant with Abraham, just giving Abraham favor. Abraham believes in me. I'm counting that as righteousness, and I am going to show him, in some cases, undeserved favor. Meanwhile, the Israelites, instead of taking the grant covenant, in their fear they draw back and they enter into a kinship covenant with God. God is their covenant partner, but he's also their God. And so if they don't obey the law, in this case the 10 Commandments, then he is obligated to come and punish them. And that is what they swear. The third major type of covenant that we find in the Bible is called a vassal covenant. A vassal covenant occurs when a greater and a lesser person or nation come into a covenant based on the greater one's ability to destroy the lesser one. Instead of destruction, the greater one offers the lesser one safety in exchange for the ability to collect taxes, to collect tributes, to collect slaves, and then the lesser person or nation has to fulfill a large number of obligations. This usually happened after one nation lost a battle to another nation. The winning army could have wiped out the losing army and all the people back in the cities that belonged to the losing army, but instead they offer terms. They say, we could kill you all, we could kill your wives, we could kill your children, but instead what we're going to do is we're going to enter into a vassal covenant with you. You are now going to be a vassal state. We are going to rule over you, and we're going to collect taxes and tribute money and things like that. So a vassal covenant, of the three that we've talked about, is the worst kind of covenant to enter into. Many Bible scholars have pointed out that when Moses renews the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy, that Israel is downgraded from a kinship covenant to a vassal covenant. Actually, the name Deuteronomy literally translates to second law. The Mosaic covenant is switched from a kinship covenant to a vassal covenant when Moses dies and Joshua takes over in Exodus 31. Moses is told to write down new rules and to put them into the ark along with the 10 Commandments. Before this time, the additional rules were instructions about how to live. Now they are part of the covenant that the Israelites have to keep. They are now obligated to keep these additional rules. Exodus chapter 30 says, Moses went out and spoke these words to all of Israel. I'm now 120 years old, and I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord has said. Then Moses summoned Joshua, and he said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with the people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them. In Deuteronomy chapter 31 we read, take this book and place it inside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, so that it may be there as a testimony against you. Now some translations say instead of putting the new covenant into the ark with the 10 Commandments, to put the new covenant in the side of the ark. And so we're not really sure if they put it inside the ark of the covenant or if they built a new container for the new covenant and put it beside the ark. Either way, there's additional laws that are added to the kinship covenant, making it a vassal covenant. Before we have the 10 commandments, now we have 630 or 631 commandments that they have to fulfill. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, the Israelites are told that if they will commit to fulfilling the covenant with God, that he will bless them. But if they aren't able to do that, if they turn away from God, and if they don't obey the commandments, then he sets before them destruction. Deuteronomy 30 says, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, his decrees, and his laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and to worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. We're going to go ahead now and pull out our first worksheet. I'm going to help you fill in the blanks on the first page. And it says, last week we read a summary of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the desert. In his last official address to the Israelites, Moses reminded them how God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, how God had given them the law at Mount Sinai, about their rebellion at Kadesh Barnea when the 12 spies were sent out into Canaan, and of the consequences of their rebellion. If you recall, no one over the age of 20 was allowed to go into the promised land with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. With the death of Moses, the task of rallying the Israelites and moving them into Canaan fell to his helper Joshua. Would the people follow Joshua, or like their fathers would they rebel? Joshua's first challenge was to cross the Jordan River while it was flooded. God told him to prepare the people to walk in a ceremonial procession, priests first, toward the Jordan. When the priests touched the water, the river stopped flowing and the water piled up, and the people were able to walk across as if on dry land. This miracle was followed by the miraculous defeat of the city of Jericho. Remember, Jericho was the city that they walked around once 6 days in a row, and then on the seventh day they walked around the city 7 times, and then they all shouted, and the Bible says that the walls came down. Now, archaeologists tell us that the walls didn't just fall over, that they actually imploded down. And so I think that that's kind of interesting, and I wanted to share that with you. Moving on, Joshua spent the next 7 years conquering the land of Canaan, moving first south and then north, just like we drew on our map just a few minutes ago. Each of the tribes was then given land area by lottery, along with the responsibility of driving out the last of the Canaanites in their area. Some of the tribes were more successful than others. During Joshua's lifetime, the Israelites had made a good start of clearing the land, but soon after his death, most of the tribes gave up. Record what the Bible says in Judges 1:28. And so we're just going to go ahead and fill that one in together also. It says, when Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. One reason the Israelites found it difficult to conquer the Canaanites may have been because they were loyal to their city-state and its king rather than to a centralized government. The promised land, therefore, had to be taken city by city. Over and over again, the tribes of Israel failed to completely do this, setting the scene for the rest of Israel's history. Moving down the page, the Canaanite religion was polytheistic and worshipped nature. It focused largely on fertility rites. Raised stone platforms were set up in high places, along with carved poles representing the tree of life. The platforms were holy to Baal, while the poles were holy to Asherah. The Canaanite religion was characterized by both sensuality and brutality. This spilled over into their day-to-day lives, as well as into their art and their literature. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, the Israelites are told to completely destroy the 7 nations of Canaan because of their idolatry and their immorality as they enter and conquer the promised land. And so it asks you to read Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, and to fill in some information about that. I'm going to have you do that on your own, and we're going to move on and talk about Canaanite gods and goddesses. So if you go ahead and turn to this worksheet in your homework packet. The first god that we're going to talk about is El. And El simply means God. That's what the word means. Some historians have associated the Canaanite god El with the Hebrew or the Israelite God just because they use the same word for God. El, Elohim, El Shaddai. The Canaanite god El was very different from the Hebrew or the Israelite God. I think they just used the same word. Next is the goddess Asherah. She was the mother goddess, a fertility goddess, the goddess of love and war. Her name means she who walks on or in the sea, and she was the wife of El. Baal actually means Lord or Master. Baal was the son of El. He was a storm god. He was the god of rain, the god of thunder, the god of fertility, and so he was the main god that they wanted to appease in order to have good weather so that they could have a good year of crops and the land would be fertile. His sister and spouse was named Anath. She was the goddess of love and violence and war. I think it's funny that love and violence and war are all put together in one goddess. And Astarte was the goddess of fertility, beauty, war, and love. She was associated with the evening star. The evening star is the first star that appears at night, and I think that that's probably the planet Venus. I need to check on that. Next, we have the god Mot. Mot actually means death. He was a god of sterility and drought and death. And interestingly, he was El's favorite son. But he was Baal's enemy. In fact, he ends up killing Baal, and Anat brings Baal back to life. Reshep was the god of lightning and of plague. Later, he became a popular protective deity who listened to people's pleas for protection. And interestingly, the Egyptians decided they wanted to worship him too, and so they adopted him as one of their gods. Shulman was the god of health. His name actually means he who brings welfare. And Koshar was the god of arts and crafts. He was similar to the Greek god Hephaestus. He was able to make magical weapons for Baal to help Baal defeat his enemies. Dagon was the Philistine god of vegetation. The Philistines believed that he was the father of Baal rather than El. I want to point out that the lower half of Dagon's body is actually a fish. And interestingly enough, archaeologists were not able to find any burial grounds for years and years in any of the Philistine cities, and so they weren't sure exactly what the Philistines did with their dead. In 1978, two brothers were out swimming along the coast of Ashkelon, one of the cities that the Philistines would have lived in, and they found a ceramic pot buried in the sand just off the coast of Ashkelon. When they informed the Office of Antiquities, they actually found dozens of these ceramic pots, and when they opened them up, they found bones. And so they thought that perhaps the Philistines buried their dead in the sea, maybe as a tribute to their fish god Dagon. They called these ceramic pots burial pots. In 2016, they actually found the very first evidence that the Philistines also had cemeteries. Now, most of the Canaanites used tombs to bury their dead in. They would set up a stone slab inside the tomb, and they would place the dead body in there. They knew that it would rot away, and then they could reuse the tomb several more times. The Philistines seem to have buried their dead, perhaps in these burial pots out at sea, and also in at least the one cemetery that they were able to find back in 2016. Moving on, we have the god Beelzebub. His name literally means prince or lord of flies, and if you have ever read the New Testament, you may be familiar with that name, because at one point Jesus was accused of being able to cast out demons through the prince of demons, Beelzebub. Moloch was the chief god of the Ammonites, and Chemosh was the chief god of the Moabites. Both of them are associated with child sacrifice. You'll notice that both of them are represented here by a large idol with hands that come out from them. Worshippers would have built a fire underneath the outstretched hands, and then they would have brought infants to be ceremonially sacrificed on the hands of Moloch and on the hands of Chemosh. And so you can see why Israelites, prophets, and why specifically Israel's God was so adamant that the Israelites not participate in this kind of worship. In fact, there are several times in the Bible where God tells the people of Israel that it never even occurred to him to have the Israelites pass their children through the fire. Passing their children through the fire was a euphemism for sacrificing your infants on these Ammonite and Moabite idols. In the time we have left, I'd like to try and fill in some of the information on some of your other worksheets in your packet this week. If you'll turn to this particular worksheet, it says, in the chart below, fill in the names of the major and the minor judges for each period of history. Fill in the names of the Canaanite nation each judge helps to defeat. And then it tells you to use the scripture references to help you. And I know that you could probably do this very easily, but since we're together, we're going to go ahead and go over it real quick. Othniel was the main judge in the first period. He helped Israel defeat the people of Aram. Ehud was the major judge in the second period, and he helped Israel defeat Moab. Deborah was the main judge in the third period, and she helped Israel defeat Hazor. Gideon was the major judge during the fourth period, and he helped Israel defeat the Midianites. Jephthah was the main judge during the fifth period, and he helped Israel defeat both the Philistines and the Ammonites. And Samson was the main judge during the sixth period, and he helped the Israelites defeat the Philistines. Now, the map below asks you to match the names of the countries conquering Israel in the Judges era to their blanks on the map below. And so from the first period, Othniel helped the Israelites defeat Aram. And so on line number 1 on the map, you're going to write in Aram. Ehud helped Israel defeat the Moabites. And so on line number 2, you're going to write Moab. Deborah helped the Israelites defeat Hazor during the third period. So on line number 3, you're going to write Hazor, and so on. And so then you can see where each of these people who tried to defeat the Israelites came from. The worksheet goes on to say Israel's final and perhaps most effective judge was Samuel. In addition to being a judge and a prophet, Samuel helped Israel transition from being a loosely governed tribal people to a monarchy. It was Samuel who anointed the first 2 kings of Israel. That would have been Saul and David. Now this week you are going to be reading in your Biblioplan, and one of the stories that she's going to hit on is the story of Ruth. And so it really helps to understand the meanings of the names of the people involved in the Ruth narrative, as well as the meanings of words like gleaning and kinsman redeemer. And so in our last few minutes together, we're just going to quickly run through word meanings and name meanings. So we're going to start with Elimelech. He was Naomi's husband, and his name means my God is king. Naomi traditionally means sweetness, but it can also mean pleasant or delightful or beautiful. Naomi and Elimelech had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And for the life of me, I don't know why they named their sons this, because Mahlon means weak, sick, and wounded. And Chilion means complete destruction. Although when I looked it up in a baby name book, a more current meaning of Chilion is kind and respectful, but at the time it would have meant complete destruction. And so it's kind of strange to me, Naomi's introducing her sons. Hi, this is my son Weakness and my other son Destruction. Boys, say hello to everybody. So anyway, now Mahlon and Chilion married 2 Moabite women. One was named Ruth and the other one was named Orpah. The name Ruth means friend or companion, and I think that's pretty appropriate because she becomes a friend and companion of her mother-in-law, Naomi. Meanwhile, Orpah literally means back of the neck, and so some people interpret that to mean fawn. For some reason, the word fawn is associated with the back of the neck, maybe because fawns have cute little backs of their necks, I don't know. But it could also be referring to someone being stiff-necked, which means that they are stubborn. If a farm animal is stiff-necked, it resists moving the way that the farmer wants it to move. It stiffens its neck and won't move. And so Orpah may mean fawn, it may mean stubborn. Boaz means swift, and Mara means bitter. Now, to glean means to gather leftover grain after a harvest. And a kinsman redeemer is a male relative who has the responsibility to help another relative in need or in danger. And so hopefully being aware of what each of those names means and the 2 vocabulary words, gleaning and kinsman redeemer, what they mean, will help you as you read through chapter 12 of your Biblioplan Ancient History Companion this next week. Don't forget to go back and complete your map as you do your homework this next week. And also, we do have a source document this next week. It says, in the 1920s, a Canaanite myth, later named the Baal cycle, was discovered in the city of Ras Shamra. The series of stories explain how Baal became the king of the gods by first defeating Yam, the god of the sea and chaos, and then defeating Mot, the god of death and drought. Historians have interpreted the struggle between Mot and Baal as the Canaanite explanation of the reason for the change in seasons. And so you are going to be reading just a small section of the Baal cycle. I don't expect you to find it entertaining, but I feel like it's important for you to become more familiar with the kinds of myths that were told by the Canaanite tribes and the kinds of things that they thought were important as revealed in their literature. As always, if you have any questions this week or need any help, you can always email me.